I would like also to cover with you technical point of this buffer zone. Are NATO allies, are those European countries ready to enforce such long buffer zone, because the front line is more than 1,000 kilometers, and are the British, French, German and other governments ready to commit such high numbers of troops to properly enforce such long buffer zone inside Ukraine?
Well, that is a very good question. And to be frank, I'm not sure what the answer is. There are many of us in Western countries like United Kingdom and France and Germany who have been calling on our governments to increase our expenditure on defence to make sure that we have the soldiers, sailors and airmen and the equipment that we need to uphold our security responsibilities. So I think it's going to be a very big ask as to whether these Western European countries, even if Russia agrees to it, would have enough manpower to man this buffer zone. I think it will have to be a buffer zone that is subject to very intense surveillance from satellites and from drones, to watch very carefully what the opposing sides are doing, and to make sure there are enough troops on the ground that can react if there are incursions. But all these things are technical matters. They're going to have to be sorted out by negotiation, and it won't be quick and it won't be easy. And certainly for Western countries, it'll be expensive.
Also, Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk said that the early stages of negotiations could begin as early as next year, at the beginning of the next year, this winter. How much time it could have how much time would it take for Ukraine, Russia and our allies to reach at least a ceasefire agreement from your perspective? Could it take months, years to negotiate a peaceful settlement of this war?
Well, again, you ask another very good question. It will all come down to the intentions of the leadership of Russia and the intentions of the leadership of Ukraine. Now, if Mr. Putin is willing to agree to a ceasefire and to agree to have talks about how the war can end, then it could happen quite quickly. But if he is not willing to do that, then you can't force him to a negotiating table. And therefore it may mean that there are more weeks and months, and heaven forbid, further years of fighting before the leadership of the warring parties feel that they want to come to a negotiating table. But it won't happen quickly until the leadership on both sides decide that the moment has come to talk, to stop, and to try and find a peace formula.
From your perspective, how can Donald Trump and another US allies force Vladimir Putin to negotiate a ceasefire in Ukraine by allowing Ukraine another strikes deep inside Russia with other missiles, or just by continuing to supporting Ukraine during this time before and after the beginning of the negotiations? What are the main instruments in the hands of Donald Trump which could help to force Vladimir Putin to negotiate with Ukraine in good faith?
Well, I think there are several things that can be done. One is to increase the economic sanctions on Russia. I mean, there is no doubt, whichever way you look at the Russian economy, it is struggling at the present time because of the cost pressures of the war. So to put more economic sanctions on Russia will undoubtedly have an effect which could well influence Vladimir Putin. But I think also third parties, and I'm particularly thinking in terms of China, if pressure can be put on China to persuade Vladimir Putin that frankly the war is getting him nowhere, then this could have quite an influence as well. Russia and China claim to have a very strong relationship, but there is no doubt that China is the strongest partner in that relationship at the present moment. So I think if pressure could be put on President Xi for himself to apply pressure to President Putin, then that's another way in which peace talks and negotiations can be accelerated to a successful conclusion.
In our previous interview conversation more than a year ago, we also covered the Putin's inner circle, and you said that Putin's general could decide to remove him from the power, could change the regime in Moscow. And my first question would be, what, from your perspective, what could those Putin's generals and his inner circle, what could they think about ceasefire? Would they be in favor of such scenario from your perspective?
Well, I still maintain that point of view, that the section of leadership in Russian society that feels the cost of the war most strongly are the generals at the top of the army. They have seen the army that they have constructed and trained and led for many, many years being destroyed in very large numbers. So you could actually argue that if they had the moral courage to stand up to Putin, that the generals could be the one to say, Mr. President, this war has got to end. It is destroying our military and it is making our country potentially weak. So I think there is still a reasonable argument that it could be the generals who might apply pressure on Vladimir Putin to say this war must stop. They can make the case that we've done our best to try and win this war for you, but frankly, our enemy, the Ukrainians, are proving so robust, supported strongly by Western countries, that we cannot win this war. And unless you want to bleed the country white, see many more hundreds of thousands of casualties, and see the economy ruined, then the time has come to seriously think about stopping this war and trying to find a peace settlement.
Also, there is an argument that Vladimir Putin cannot try to find this exit from this situation, cannot end the war against Ukraine because his inner circle and his society still supports aggressive war against Ukraine. Do you believe in that? Can Vladimir Putin really end this war against Ukraine if there is a peaceful settlement? And another question, if Vladimir Putin decides to end this war but on not really pro-Russian terms, could he really face another coup against him from those pro-war generals, pro-war mercenaries?
Well, I think what Putin will want to do, if the war is going to end in any way other than he having achieved complete victory over Ukraine, which will not happen, then he has to have a narrative. He has to have an explanation to the people in Russia why he has stopped the war. And he'll have to be able to tell them that he's achieved sufficient of his objectives. Now, it looks as if, with Russian soldiers controlling parts of the four eastern oblasts, the four eastern provinces of Ukraine, this may be sufficient grounds, sufficient narrative, if you like, for him to say that he has achieved what he wants to achieve. But if he wants to stay in power, and I'm sure that he does, he'll have to find a way of explaining to the Russian people why he didn't achieve overall victory over Ukraine, but he has achieved enough to call this a success. Otherwise, his days as president, I think, will be numbered, even despite the very tight control that he has over the state media and the tight control that he has over even social media within Russia.
Is there a chance that Vladimir Putin fails to explain this end of the war against Ukraine? Can he really fail to do so? And if he fails to properly explain, convince, persuade his population that it was the right thing to do, what could happen next? Do you expect his generals' inner circle to decide to remove him from power after the ceasefire or any kind of peaceful settlement of the war?
Well, that, of course, obviously is Putin's concern, that if he is felt by the inner circle and by the leadership and by influential sections of the Russian population that he has failed, then he runs the grave risk of being deposed, which of course then begs the related question, as who is going to replace him. The way of a dictator is to make sure that there are not other obvious candidates who are standing in the wings. So I think it's a very open question as to if Putin falls, if Putin is deposed, who is going to replace him? And is this going to be a more moderate person or another hardliner? It's a very open question, and I think very difficult to speculate about.
Also, I'd like to cover with you recent call between the General Charles Brown and American general and the Russian General Gerasimov. In the recent phone call, Gerasimov said that the launch of Russia's intercontinental ballistic missile was not a kind of response to American decision to allow Ukraine to strike inside Russia. So he just has contradicted Vladimir Putin's narrative about the response to American decision to strike inside, to allow Ukraine to strike inside Russia. From your perspective, why does General Gerasimov contradict even Putin's narrative, Putin's words about the Oreshnik missile response to American decision to allow Ukraine to strike inside Russia?
Well, I think Gerasimov is a military man, and he understands that in a military operation, you need to do all that you possibly can to gain a position of superiority. And he will recognize that from the Ukrainian point of view, and the supporters of Ukraine, like the United States, United Kingdom, and other countries that have been supplying potentially highly effective long-range weapons, that of course Ukraine wants to use those weapons on battlefield targets, even striking deep into Russia, and that is quite a legitimate aspect of war. I think the medium-range intercontinental ballistic missile that Russia fired into the Dnipro area was a statement. It was saying that we can increase the stakes here, but this is keeping the issue still well below the nuclear threshold, and that is obviously the right thing to do. But I think Gerasimov can probably see the military logic of what the Ukrainians, with the support of their Western allies, are doing, and that he understands that.
Also, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky said that the collapse of Bashar Assad regime in Syria was due to the absence of Russian troops there, who are all engaged in fighting against Ukraine. Do you agree with that?
Yes, I do. I think the Syrian rebels, the Syrian resistance, have watched very carefully what has been going on in Russia and Ukraine, has watched very carefully what's been going on between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon, and Israel and Hamas in Gaza, and have come to the conclusion that both Russia and Iran are weakened, and have chosen this moment to strike. And they've struck most effectively and managed to overthrow the Assad regime in a matter of two or three weeks. So they have looked, they've thought, they've planned very carefully, and they have been successful. And there is no doubt that when push comes to shove, Putin decided that he could not afford to divert aircraft and military manpower to further support the Assad regime, and rather cynically abandoned his ally in the region, Assad.
So Vladimir Putin was like a rat in the corner because he could not deploy additional resources to Syria, because all resources are already committed to the war against Ukraine. But if he have decided to do so, what would it be needed for Russia to save this Assad regime? Several thousand troops, or even several 100,000 troops to save Assad's regime? And what is your take on that, about this price to save the Assad regime?
Well, we're talking hypothetically now, because it will not happen. The Assad regime has gone. There is no way that even if Vladimir Putin had a spare 250,000 soldiers, that he could restore that regime now. The Assad regime is history, it is past, it is gone. I think the interesting thing, and it's an open question, is what is going to be the future government, the future governance of Syria. Is al-Jilani and his HTS faction able to bring other partners together to build a consensus, to build a new government in Syria for the benefit of all the Syrian people? That is the hope, but we'll have to watch and wait and see. But in their weakened state, there is very little, if anything, that the Russians can do to influence that, and much the same goes for the Iranians as well. Their major tool of influence, Hezbollah, has been politically decapitated and its military capability seriously eroded. So the Syrian rebels chose their moment, they chose it well, they've unseated the Assad regime, and there's nothing that Moscow or Tehran can do about that.
Also, Ukrainian military intelligence reported about the redeployment of military ships and military personnel, Russian military personnel, out of the Syria. How can this reputational disaster play for Vladimir Putin's grip on power? How can it influence his reputation as an international player, as many Russians thought before?
Well, the events in Syria come at a very fortuitous time as far as Ukraine is concerned. If you go back to our earlier conversation about potential negotiations, Ukraine needs to be able to negotiate in a position of strength, and ideally with Russia in a position of weakness. And what has happened in Syria undoubtedly weakens Russia's position, and therefore this is very much to Ukraine's advantage. If, excuse me, if there are going to be negotiations starting early in the new year, encouraged by Donald Trump.
Also, Israel has conducted airstrikes on Syrian strategic weaponry, chemical weapons and cruise missiles and other items of Bashar al-Assad strategic weaponry. Also, the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu said that Israeli government is trying to take all the actions needed to ensure Israeli security with regard to the new situation in Syria. Does it mean that Israel is trying to exploit current situation in Syria in its own favor?
Well, to an extent, Israel is trying to do that, but then you have to put it in the widest possible context that Israel has the right to defend its own security. It is surrounded by Muslim Arab countries. It has been fighting against Hezbollah and Hamas, whose sworn objective is the eradication of the state of Israel. And you only have to go back a few decades when all Arab countries, such as Syria and Egypt and Jordan, were vowed to eradicate Israel. So if Israel is taking the opportunity to increase its own security by making strikes against what it believes are Syrian chemical weapon depots and possible other weapons that the Syrians have got, I think they're doing it more to protect their own security rather than trying to influence the future government and future governance of Syria. So I think if you see it in that context, while I don't agree with it, I can understand why Israel might be doing these things at this precise moment.
Also, Israeli Prime Minister has announced its military has temporarily seized control of a demilitarized zone in the Golan Heights, saying the 1974 agreement with Syria had collapsed with the rebel takeover of the country. What is your reaction to this incursion into the Golan Heights by the Israeli armed forces?
Well, I'm afraid it's an extension of what we were just talking about. In the new circumstances, a country like Israel, which is determined to preserve its own security, will take advantage of the new circumstances and try and push to increase its own security. It's opportunistic. I think it's unfortunate, but in the light of Israel remaining very fearful of the attitude of its neighbors, then you can understand why they've done what they've done. Because after all, we don't know at this precise moment in time what the future government of Syria is going to be like. We would hope that it might be a more moderate government. It might be a government that is interested in Syria for the Syrian people, to try and build up the Syrian economy, try and restore its infrastructure, and not have malign attitudes as far as Israel is concerned. But of course, from Tel Aviv's point of view, they can't guarantee that at the present moment. So you can understand why they might be pushing to improve their own security situation, albeit it is taking advantage of an unfortunate set of circumstances which have occurred in Syria for other reasons.
From your perspective, is there a chance for democratic elections in Syria after this recent developments, and what kind of roles the United States, the United Kingdom and other allies can play in ensuring Syrian future, democratic future of Syria?
Well, I think countries like the United States, the United Kingdom, and other Western countries need to be very careful about what they hope for and what they try and achieve. I think the track record of interventions in Iraq, of intervention in Libya by Western governments hoping to impose a democratic government, that outcome has been pretty poor. So I think we need to leave it to the Syrian people to work out how they want to govern their own country in the future. If they ask for advice and if they ask for support, well, then I'm sure Western countries will be willing to give it to them. But that is very different to us intervening and us imposing what we believe are important values and standards that we believe in on other people. I think what's really important is that we give the Syrian people the space and the dignity to work out their own future government, their own future governance, in the best interests of all the people of Syria. That's what I would hope is going to happen over the next few weeks and months.
And my last question for you would be about the Iranian regime. It seems like the situation in Syria, the collapse of the Bashar Assad regime has revealed weaknesses of the Iranian regime in the regard of that Iran could not help Bashar Assad to stay in power. How can this development and this weakness of the Iranian regime influence its cooperation with Russia in regard of the support for Russia's war effort?
Well, I think a number of things have played to come together to weaken the regime in Tehran. The way that the Israelis have pounded Hamas in Gaza, the way that they have decapitated the political leadership of Hezbollah, significantly reduced Hezbollah's military capability. These things are very damaging as far as Tehran is concerned. And now that we've seen the Syrian government fall, the Assad regime fall, despite Iran's support for it, this all plays into the narrative of the Tehran regime being weakened and being weaker than the leadership would like. And don't forget, there is quite an active resistance within Tehran to the Ayatollah's leadership. So it's not inconceivable that we could see even further change in the region. It's not inconceivable that the opposition might become bolder in Iran and even try and push to overthrow the regime there. We've seen this going back as far as 2009 and the elections then, when there was considerable resistance, and that is there and has continued. So I think we shall watch what happens in Iran, watch what happens in the power struggle in Tehran very carefully over the next few weeks and months.
Thank you, Lord Dannatt, for your time and for supporting Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Thank you. A pleasure to talk to you this afternoon.